The mountainside is still moving. Not from an earthquake, not from erosion, from dynamite blasts set off nearly a century ago, deep inside a hill that miners hollowed out from the inside like the core of an apple. Buildings in Jerome, Arizona don't just decay. They travel. The old jailhouse has slid 225 feet downhill from where it was built, dragged slowly across the earth by tunnels blasted directly beneath it. A town built on top of its own grave. By the time the mines closed, this narrow strip of buildings clinging to Cleopatra Hill had produced over $1 billion in copper, gold, silver, and zinc. Enough wealth to help power an industrial nation. And still, the ground underneath it kept sliding away, inch by inch, as if the mountain itself were trying to shrug the town off its back. This is the story of how a town built a fortune by hollowing out the earth beneath its own feet, and how that same earth eventually took everything back. Before the money, there was just a hillside. In 1876, a prospector named Old Seba spotted mineral outcroppings on a remote slope above the Vede Valley, high desert country in central Arizona territory. The land held color, streaks of green and blue that told experienced eyes there was copper underneath. But turning a promising hillside into a functioning mine took capital, and capital took investors willing to gamble on land most people considered worthless. A New York lawyer named Eugene Murray Jerome became one of those investors. He never lived in the town that would carry his name. He financed it from 3,000 miles away, sight unseen, betting on a hillside he would likely never visit. The United Vede Copper Company formed in 1882. Almost immediately, it hit trouble. Copper prices collapsed the following year, and the mine that had barely begun operating was forced to shut its doors. Investors walked away. The gamble looked finished before it had really started. But the ore was still there. Rich, high-grade copper, sitting untouched underground, waiting for someone patient enough, or reckless enough, to try again. That person was William Andrews Clark. Clark was already a mining magnate, a man who understood that copper was becoming the metal of the future. Electricity was spreading across America, and electricity needed copper wire, miles and miles of it. In 1888, Clark bought the United Vede Copper Company for $80,000. It would become one of the most profitable investments of his life. Under Clark's control, Jerome stopped being a speculative claim and became a machine. Shafts plunged deeper into Cleopatra Hill. Smelters rose along the slopes, and their smoke became a permanent fixture on the horizon. A narrow-gauge railroad snaked up the mountainside to move ore in and workers back and forth. The town grew the way boom towns grow, fast, chaotic, and without much regard for comfort or safety. Word travels quickly when there's money underground. Immigrants poured in from across the world. Mexico, Italy, Ireland, Croatia, China, each community carving out its own corner of the hillside, building homes wherever there was flat enough ground to stand on. There wasn't much of that. Streets stacked on top of streets, staircases doubling as roads, buildings practically leaning on each other for support. Then came World War I. Wartime demand sent copper prices soaring, and Jerome exploded into a full-blown boomtown. The population surged past 15,000 people, making it, for a time, one of the largest towns in the entire Arizona territory. Hotels went up specifically to house the flood of miners. Saloons and gambling halls operated around the clock, matching the mines themselves, which never stopped running. Day shift, night shift. The machinery of extraction didn't sleep, and neither did the town built to service it. Outsiders had a name for what Jerome had become. They called it the wickedest town in the West. It wasn't an exaggeration built for headlines. Jerome earned the reputation through sheer density of vice packed into a few steep blocks, brothels, gambling parlors, saloons stacked one after another along streets barely wide enough for a wagon to turn around in. But underneath the noise and neon of boomtown nightlife, something else was happening. Something structural. Something almost nobody paying for a drink at the bar bothered to think about. The mines were eating the mountain from the inside. Every new shaft, every new tunnel, every ounce of copper pulled from the rock left behind an absence, a void where solid ground used to be. And voids don't stay empty forever. The earth above them settles, shifts, and eventually moves to fill the space that used to be full. At first, it seemed insignificant. A crack in a foundation here, a door that no longer closed quite right. Small, easy to dismiss. The ordinary aches of a town built in a hurry on uneven ground. Nobody was worried yet. There was too much money coming out of the earth to worry about what the earth was doing in return. Then, in 1917, a different kind of instability surfaced. this one among the people, not the ground beneath them. Miners had grown frustrated. Wages hadn't kept pace with the dangers of the job or the profits the mine was generating, and unionization efforts were spreading through mining towns across the American West. In Jerome, that tension reached a breaking point. A group of armed vigilantes, working with the mining company's blessing, rounded up more than 100 striking miners and union sympathizers at gunpoint. They were forced onto cattle cars and shipped out of town, abandoned along the desert tracks with no way back. It became known as the Jerome deportation, a brutal demonstration of exactly how much power the mining company held over the people who lived and worked beneath it. The company that owned the ground people walked on could, if it chose to, decide who was allowed to stay. The mine's grip on the town was absolute, and its grip on the mountain was starting to slip. By the 1920s, the underground fires began. Deep inside the mine, pockets of sulfide or had ignited, a slow-burning chemical reaction triggered by exposure to air during excavation. These weren't fires that could simply be extinguished. They smoldered far below the surface, out of reach, spreading through old tunnels and abandoned shafts for years at a time. Smoke started rising from cracks in the ground. Not from a chimney, not from a smelter, from the earth itself, venting heat from fires burning beneath people's homes. The company's answer was almost unthinkable. If the underground fires couldn't be reached from below, they would simply mine around them from above, carving out a massive open pit. The Jerome, later renamed the United Verde Extension Pit, tearing away the surface layer to get at what remained of the old body without descending into the burning tunnels underneath. It worked, in the sense that copper kept coming out of the ground. But it also meant the mountain itself was being restructured, piece by piece, to accommodate a fire nobody could put out. And still, the buildings above kept moving. Dynamite blasting inside the mine sent vibrations rippling up through the rock, loosening the ground beneath entire city blocks. The jailhouse, a heavy, reinforced concrete structure built to hold prisoners securely, began sliding downhill, carried slowly by the shifting earth beneath its foundation. Over the following decades, it would travel more than 200 feet from where it was originally built, coming to rest lower on the slope, tilted and cracked, a monument to a town that was quite literally coming apart at the seams. Homes cracked down the middle. Streets buckled. Residents grew used to repairing damage that had nothing to do with weather or age, damage caused by the very industry that put food on their tables. Jerome had built its fortune by hollowing out the ground beneath it. Now the ground was collecting on that debt. Through the Depression, Jerome held on. Copper prices crashed along with everything else in America, and for a while it looked as though the town's first true collapse had arrived. But World War II changed the equation again. The country needed copper for wiring, for shell casings, for the machinery of a global war, and Jerome's mines roared back to life one more time. It would be the last boom the town would ever see. By the early 1950s, the richest ore in Cleopatra Hill had finally run out. Not overnight, mines rarely die that way. It was a slow retreat, fewer shifts, smaller crews, machinery falling silent one section at a time until, in 1953, the Phelps Dodge Corporation, which had absorbed the mining operations years earlier, shut the last of it down for good. The effect on the town was immediate and merciless. There was no other industry to fall back on. No agriculture, no manufacturing, nothing built on a foundation other than the mine itself. When the mine died, the reason for Jerome's existence died with it. People left by the thousands. Entire households packed up and abandoned homes they couldn't sell, because there was no one left to sell them to. Furniture stayed behind. Personal belongings stayed behind. Whole houses were simply left standing empty, doors unlocked, as families drove away from a town that no longer had any way to support them. Within a few years, the population that had once topped 15,000 had collapsed to fewer than 100 people. A town built for 15,000, inhabited by a number you could count in an afternoon. The empty buildings didn't just sit quietly, waiting, untended, and still resting on ground weakened by decades of blasting underneath. Structures continued to shift and crack. Roofs collapsed. Walls buckled outward. Nature and gravity did what dynamite had started, slowly reclaiming what people no longer had the numbers to maintain. By the late 1950s, Jerome had become something close to what people now imagine when they hear the words ghost town. Not abandoned in the space of a single night, but hollowed out gradually, the way the mountain itself had been hollowed out decades before. Some accounts of the era describe it as the largest ghost town in America, a title earned less through drama than through sheer scale. An entire town, built to house tens of thousands, standing mostly empty on a mountainside nobody had any more reason to climb. That should have been the end of the story. Instead, it was only the beginning of a different one. In the 1960s, something unexpected started happening on the abandoned slopes of Cleopatra Hill. Artists began arriving, drawn not by copper, but by cheap real estate, dramatic mountain views, and the strange, undeniable beauty of a town frozen mid-collapse. Empty storefronts became studios. Crumbling Victorian buildings became galleries. A handful of residents who had never left were joined by a new wave of people who saw creative opportunity in decay rather than tragedy. It was a quiet, unlikely rebirth. Jerome didn't rebuild what it had lost. It became something else entirely. A town that survives now on tourism, art, and the very history that once nearly erased it. Visitors climbed the same steep, winding streets that miners once walked home on after 12-hour shifts. They wander past buildings still noticeably tilted, still bearing the cracks left by dynamite blasts from nearly a century ago. The old hospital that once treated injured and dying miners, a building associated with thousands of deaths during Jerome's boom years, now operates as a hotel, one that leans heavily into its reputation for hauntings, drawing visitors curious about the darker side of the town's past. The sliding jail is still there too, resting where it eventually came to a stop after its decades-long journey downhill. People photograph it now. Take note of the cracks running through its walls. Few pause to consider what it actually represents. Physical proof that the ground beneath an entire town was never as solid as the people building on top of it assumed. Jerome today has a population in the low hundreds, nowhere near its wartime peak, but enough to sustain a living community rather than an abandoned relic. Restaurants, wine tasting rooms, art studios, and small museums now occupy buildings that once housed miners' families, saloon keepers, and company officials. But walk far enough past the tourist shops, and the industrial scars are still visible. The open pit that was carved out to bypass underground fires no one could extinguish. Rusted mining equipment left behind, too heavy and too obsolete to be worth hauling away. Foundations of buildings that never made it through the decades of shifting ground, reduced now to little more than outlines in the dirt. There's a strange irony sitting at the center of Jerome's story. The very thing that built the town, hollowing out the earth in search of wealth, was also the thing that slowly, methodically undermined it. Every shaft dug, every blast set off, every tunnel extracted was also, quietly, a withdrawal against the ground the town itself was standing on. The people of Jerome spent 70 years pulling fortune out of the mountain, never fully reckoning with the fact that the mountain was being asked to give up its own foundation to provide it. Nobody moved to Jerome imagining they were building on borrowed ground. They built hotels, churches, a jailhouse meant to last generations, believing solid rock was as permanent as it looked. It wasn't the copper running out that truly broke Jerome. Long before the last shift ended in 1953, the earth itself had already been rendering its verdict. One crack, one shifted foundation, one slow inch of sliding stone at a time. The mountain gave Jerome everything it needed to become a city. And then, slowly, deliberately, it began taking the ground back.
Thanks for watching. Like our video and subscribe to our channel for more videos. Thank you.